Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Matt stood in the center of the Newman living room with a stillness that felt louder than any scream, the sealed envelope in his hand weighing more than the decades of lies it contained, and when he finally spoke, his voice cut through the air like a blade as he announced that the DNA results were no longer rumors, no longer threats, but undeniable truth, proof printed in cold ink that rewrote history itself, and Victor Newman, powerful, untouchable Victor, felt something crack inside him as Matt laid the papers on the table and declared that the blood in his veins was Newman blood, Victor's blood, his son, his flesh and bone, the living consequence of a past Victor had buried so deep he convinced himself it never existed, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt as Victor stared at the results, his hands trembling despite his iron control, his mind racing back through a lifetime of ruthless choices, secret affairs, abandoned responsibilities, and ruthless survival instincts, all colliding in one horrifying realization that the enemy he had hunted, manipulated, and underestimated was not just a rival but his own heir. While Nick stood frozen at first, his jaw tightening as the truth sank in, anger boiling beneath his skin like a storm waiting to explode, because this wasn't just about Matt existing, it was about betrayal layered upon betrayal, about a father who preached loyalty and family while hiding sins that now threatened to tear everything apart, and Nick's voice finally erupted, raw and furious, accusing Victor of destroying their family yet again, of creating chaos and then demanding everyone else clean up the wreckage, his rage fueled not only by shock but by the fear that everything he believed about his place in the Newman legacy had just been shaken to its core. As Matt watched them both with a dangerous calm, years of resentment and pain etched into his eyes, because for him this moment wasn't just revelation, it was reckoning, a long-awaited collision between the man who denied him and the family that benefited from his absence, and as Victor demanded to know how long Matt had known, how long he'd been playing this twisted game, Matt answered with brutal honesty, admitting that he had lived with the truth like a loaded gun in his pocket, waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger, waiting until Victor had everything to lose, and Victor's fury flared, instinctively shifting into defense mode, accusing Matt of manipulation, of revenge, of trying to destroy the Newman empire from the inside, but even as the words left his mouth, Victor knew they rang hollow, because no amount of bluster could erase the DNA results staring back at him, no amount of power could undo the fact that his past had returned with teeth, while Nick paced the room like a caged animal, demanding answers about who else knew, about how many lies had been stacked on top of this one, his anger sharpening into something colder and more dangerous as he realized Matt wasn't just Victor's son, he was a threat, a rival with a legitimate claim to everything Nick had fought for his entire life, and Matt didn't shy away from that implication, quietly suggesting that blood mattered in the Newman world, that Victor himself had built his empire on that belief, and now the rules Victor wrote were coming back to judge him, causing Victor to lash out, warning Matt that being his son didn't grant him loyalty or love, that the Newman name was earned through strength and survival. But the warning sounded less like dominance and more like fear, because for the first time in decades Victor Newman was facing a truth he couldn't control, and as the tension thickened, memories flooded the room, every battle Victor and Nick had fought, every betrayal they survived together, now poisoned by the knowledge that Victor had kept something this devastating hidden, and Nick's anger shifted into heartbreak as he accused his father of choosing secrecy over family yet again, of prioritizing power over honesty, his voice cracking as he asked how many times Victor planned to tear them apart and still call it protection, while Matt watched Nick with a complicated mix of resentment and curiosity, seeing in him the brother who had lived the life he was denied, the son who received Victor's guidance, approval, and constant manipulation, and in that charged silence, the unspoken truth loomed that this revelation wasn't the end but the beginning of a war that would redefine the Newman family forever. Because blood had been exposed, alliances shattered, and the line between enemy and heir blurred beyond recognition, leaving Victor standing at the center of the wreckage of his own making, forced to confront the unforgivable secret that his past was no longer buried, no longer silent, but alive, angry, and ready to claim what was taken, as Nick stormed out, unable to bear another second in the same room, and Matt remained, locking eyes with Victor in a silent challenge that promised this was only the first collapse, only the first crack in a dynasty built on secrets, and that from this moment on, nothing in the Newman world would ever be the same. The silence Nick left behind felt heavier than his anger, a suffocating void that pressed down on Victor's chest as the front door slammed shut, echoing like a gunshot through the Newman house, and Victor remained rooted in place, staring at Matt as though looking at a ghost he had tried to kill years ago, his mind warring between instinct and truth, power and guilt, because the DNA results didn't just expose a son, they exposed a fracture in the foundation of everything Victor Newman had ever claimed to stand for, and Matt broke the silence first, his tone low and deliberate as he told Victor that Nick's reaction was only the beginning, that the fallout from this revelation would ripple outward, tearing through every relationship, every alliance, every carefully constructed lie Victor had used to maintain control, and Victor snapped back with his usual thunder, insisting that he would handle this, that no one would dictate the fate of the Newman family to him, least of all a man who had spent years operating in the shadows, but Matt didn't flinch, reminding Victor that shadows were where unwanted sons were forced to grow, where resentment hardened into strategy, and as Victor demanded to know what Matt wanted, money, power, revenge, Matt answered with a truth that unsettled Victor more than any threat, saying he wanted acknowledgement, not just in private, not just on paper, but publicly, because blood denied was still blood. And Victor's jaw tightened as he realized this wasn't a battle he could win with intimidation alone, because every instinct told him to crush Matt, to neutralize him as he had done to countless enemies before, yet the DNA results burned like a brand, marking Matt as something Victor could not erase without destroying himself, and as Victor tried to regain control, pacing the room and issuing orders that sounded hollow even to his own ears, Matt calmly revealed that copies of the DNA results already existed, safely stored with people Victor couldn't silence, a contingency plan built from years of knowing exactly who Victor Newman was, and that revelation struck Victor harder than any insult, because it meant Matt hadn't just uncovered the truth, he had prepared for war, and somewhere deep inside Victor felt an emotion he despised, respect, because the strategy, the foresight, the ruthless patience, it was all unmistakably Newman, and the realization that his blood ran through Matt only deepened the horror of what he had created, while elsewhere Nick drove aimlessly through Genoa City, his hands clenched wide around the steering wheel, rage and betrayal crashing together inside him as memories replayed with brutal clarity, every lecture Victor had ever given about loyalty, every demand for obedience in the name of family, now poisoned by the knowledge that Victor had hidden a brother from him, a brother who now threatened to dismantle everything Nick had sacrificed for. And Nick's anger wasn't just directed at Victor anymore, it was turning inward, questioning his own identity, his place in the Newman hierarchy, wondering if blood really was destiny in his father's world or if it was just another weapon Victor used when it suited him. And back at the ranch, Matt pressed further, telling Victor that he wasn't there to beg or threaten, that the truth was out and Victor's response would determine whether this ended in coexistence or mutual destruction, and Victor, ever defiant, warned Matt that stepping into the Newman family meant stepping into a battlefield where survival demanded absolute loyalty, but Matt countered that loyalty was earned, not demanded, and that Victor had forfeited the right to dictate terms the moment he denied his own son, and the words cut deep, exposing a wound Victor had never allowed himself to feel, a buried memory of a woman he once loved and abandoned, of a choice he made that prioritized ambition over responsibility, and, for the first time in decades, Victor Newman felt the weight of regret pressing against his armor, even as he refused to show it, while the larger Newman family began to sense the shift, whispers spreading, tension thickening as Nikki noticed Victor's uncharacteristic silence, as Victoria sensed something wrong in the air, and as the walls of secrecy Victor relied upon began to crack under the pressure of an unavoidable truth, and when Nick finally returned, his anger sharpened into resolve as he confronted Victor again, demanding clarity, demanding honesty, demanding to know whether Victor intended to acknowledge Matt or erase him like so many inconvenient truths before, and Victor, torn between pride and damage control, attempted to frame Matt as a manipulator exploiting a biological technicality, but Nick exploded, accusing Victor of rewriting reality to suit himself, of refusing to take responsibility for the pain he caused, and Nick's words struck something raw in Matt, who finally snapped back at Nick, pointing out that while Nick grew up fighting for his father's approval, he at least had a father to fight for, and the confrontation ignited years of unspoken resentment, as Nick and Matt squared off, two men shaped by the same blood but forged in entirely different fires, each seeing in the other a reflection of what they might have been under different circumstances. And Victor watched them with a complex mix of fear and awe, realizing that his greatest legacy might not be his empire but the chaos his choices had unleashed. And as voices rose and alliances fractured, the truth became undeniable that this revelation was not a single moment of shock but a turning point, a fault line splitting the Newman dynasty down the middle, forcing every member to choose sides, to question loyalties, to redefine what family truly meant. And as the night wore on, Victor retreated into himself, alone with the consequences of his past, while Matt stood his ground, refusing to be pushed back into the shadows, and Nick walked away again, not in rage this time but in painful determination, knowing that the Newman family he thought he understood was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, where blood was both bond and weapon, secrets were currency, and the unforgivable truth that Victor's past had returned was no longer just a threat but a living force poised to reshape Genoa City forever. Night settled heavily over the Newman ranch, but sleep was impossible for anyone touched by the truth that had detonated there. And Victor stood alone in his study long after the echoes of raised voices had faded. The DNA papers spread across his desk like a death sentence written in scientific certainty, each line confirming what his instincts already knew yet his pride refused to accept, that Matt was his son, not a rumor, not a manipulation, but a living extension of a past mistake Victor had believed himself strong enough to bury. And as he stared at his own name reflected back at him in the genetic markers, memories he had sealed away began clawing to the surface, flashes of a woman he once loved and abandoned, of choices made in the ruthless pursuit of power, of moments where ambition outweighed responsibility, and for the first time in years Victor felt something dangerously close to fear, not of Matt alone but of what acknowledging him would unleash, because the Newman empire was built on control, on hierarchy, on Victor deciding who mattered and who didn't, and Matt's existence shattered that illusion completely. While across town Nick sat alone in the dark, replaying every interaction he'd ever had with his father through this new, brutal lens, wondering how many truths Victor had hidden, how many times Nick had defended a man who preached family values while betraying them in secret, and his anger hardened into something colder, more focused, as he realized this wasn't just about Matt stealing a piece of Victor's attention or legacy, it was about Victor once again proving that honesty was optional when power was at stake. And Nick vowed silently that he would not let this secret be spun, buried, or weaponized without a fight, even if it meant standing against his own father, while Matt remained at the ranch longer than expected, refusing Victor's demand that he leave, asserting his right to be there not as an enemy but as blood, and the tension between them was thick with unspoken truths as Victor finally demanded to know what Matt planned to do next, and Matt answered that the truth was already moving beyond those walls, that whispers were spreading, that the Newman name thrived on perception and once cracks appeared, the whole city would sense it, and Victor bristled, accusing Matt of threatening the family, but Matt fired back that Victor had threatened the family the moment he chose secrecy over responsibility, and the accusation hit harder than Victor wanted to admit, because deep down he knew Matt was right, and when Nikki finally confronted Victor, her eyes searching his face for denial he could no longer give, the admission landed like a blow. Her shock quickly giving way to devastation as she realized the magnitude of the lie Victor had lived with for decades, and Nikki's pain cut through Victor's defenses in a way no enemy ever could, as she questioned how he could hide something so monumental, how he could look their children in the eye while keeping a brother from them, and Victor, uncharacteristically quiet, offered no defense that didn't sound hollow even to himself, while Victoria reacted with calculated restraint, absorbing the information with a strategist's mind, already considering the corporate implications, the power shifts, the risk of Matt asserting a claim not just to Victor's bloodline but to Newman Enterprises itself, and her calm only fueled Nick's fury when he confronted her, accusing her of treating this like a business crisis instead of a family implosion, and Victoria snapped back that in the Newman world, family and business were inseparable, and ignoring that reality was what allowed disasters like this to fester, and as the siblings clashed, Matt observed from the sidelines, realizing that his mere existence had turned the Newmans against one another faster than any external enemy ever could, and the realization was both vindicating and unsettling, because while he had dreamed of exposing Victor, he hadn't fully prepared for the collateral damage, yet he refused to retreat, reminding himself that this chaos was not his doing but Victor's, And when Victor finally announced that he would handle the situation publicly in his own time, Nick exploded. Again, accusing him of trying to control the narrative, to shape the truth into something palatable, something that preserved Victor's image at the expense of honesty, and Nick declared that if Victor didn't come clean, he would, a threat that stunned the room into silence, because Nick had never openly challenged Victor's authority like that before, and Victor's response was swift and icy, warning Nick not to confuse emotion with strategy, but Nick stood his ground, stating that this wasn't strategy, it was accountability, and Matt watched the exchange with a complicated mix of satisfaction and guilt, because while he had anticipated Victor's resistance, he hadn't expected Nick to become such a volatile variable, and later, alone with Nick, Matt attempted a fragile truce, acknowledging that neither of them had chosen this situation, that they were both victims of Victor's choices in different ways. But Nick wasn't ready for reconciliation, his anger too raw, his trust too damaged. As he accused Matt of enjoying the chaos, of positioning himself as both victim and threat, and Matt didn't deny that he had waited for the right moment, but he insisted that revenge was not the same as justice, that being denied a father left scars Nick could never fully understand, and the words struck Nick deeply, forcing him to confront an uncomfortable truth, that while Victor had hurt him repeatedly, he had still been present, still shaped Nick's life in ways Matt had been denied entirely. And the realization only deepened the emotional divide between them, while Victor retreated further into damage control mode, making calls, issuing quiet warnings, preparing contingency plans, because the businessman in him refused to be overtaken by the father he had avoided being for so long, yet every move he made felt slower, heavier, as though the weight of the truth was finally catching up to him. And as Genoa City buzzed with rumors, as alliances shifted and enemies watched eagerly from the sidelines, sensing weakness in the Newman armor, Victor realized with grim clarity that Matt was not just a personal reckoning but a strategic nightmare, a legitimate heir whose existence threatened to destabilize everything Victor had built, and yet, beneath the fear and fury, there was something else Victor could no longer ignore, a reluctant recognition that Matt's strength, intelligence, and ruthless patience were reflections of his own, that the son he had abandoned had grown into a man worthy of the Newman name, and that realization haunted Victor more than any threat ever could, because it meant that denying Matt was no longer just cruel, it was cowardly, and as the family fractured further, as Nick drew lines he refused to cross back over, as Nikki grappled with betrayal and grief, as Victoria calculated and adjusted, and as Matt stood unbowed in the face of it all, the truth became inescapable that the Newman family had crossed a point of no return, that blood once hidden had been exposed, and that Victor Newman, titan of industry and master manipulator, was finally facing the one opponent he could not intimidate, outmaneuver, or destroy without losing everything, his own past, his own blood. And the unforgivable secret that now threatened to redefine not just his family, but his legacy forever. Morning crept over the Newman ranch with a pale, unforgiving light, illuminating the damage the night had done not just to relationships but to illusions long protected by power and silence, and Victor awoke with a heaviness in his chest that no amount of resolve could shake, because for the first time in his life the problem before him could not be solved with money, threats, or strategy alone, and as he stood at the window looking out over the land he had conquered and claimed, he wondered whether this empire, built on strength and control, had finally grown too large for him to hold together, while downstairs Nikki sat with a cold cup of coffee, staring into nothing, replaying every moment she thought she knew Victor completely, now questioning how many versions of him had existed all along, and when Victor joined her, the silence between them was more painful than any argument, because there were no justifications left that could undo decades of deception, and elsewhere Nick prepared himself for the day ahead with grim determination, knowing that whatever came next would define who he was apart from his father, apart from the Newman name, as he resolved not to let Victor dictate the truth any longer, even if exposing it cost him everything, while Matt watched the family from a distance, fully aware that the storm he unleashed was only beginning, yet refusing to regret it, because for the first time in his life his existence could no longer be denied or erased, and as the sun rose higher over Genoa City, casting long shadows across boardrooms, penthouses, and whispered conversations, one truth settled in with brutal clarity: the Newman dynasty had been permanently altered, blood had rewritten the rules, and the battle ahead would not be fought solely in public statements or corporate maneuvers, but in the hearts of a family forced to confront the consequences of a past that refused to stay buried.